Hey folks, I'm Chuck Black. We're doing Quaka Prime from scratch, and in today's lesson, we're going to start to talk about adding database capability to our Quaka Prime. Specifically, we're using the Mongo database technology, and this lesson is going to be the first of at least two, maybe more lessons on Mongo. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to want to do is install Mongo. So I have Googled Mongo installation. I'm here on the docs mongodb.com installation page. You can see there's information here about installing Mongo. There are different types of Mongo depending on your operating system. There's a number of installations for different versions of Linux. There's a Mac OS one, which is what I did on this page. You can also do it for Windows, etc. So you need to follow that. I'm not going to go through the entire installation process because my installation environment may be different than yours, and this may change between the time that I record this and you're going through it. So follow the instructions on the Mongo page and get it installed on your system. So once you have installed Mongo, you should be able to access it via the client. I'm going to type in Mongo and it is going to actually run. It's going to tell me that the Mongo shell has been superseded by Mongo SH. I guess I should have printed that out. It's probably telling me the version. So here's the version that is running. And now I can do commands. Now the commands for Mongo, we're not going to have a detailed discussion of all of these. The documentation is pretty plentiful out there, so you should be able to Google it or do the Mongo documentation. One thing that we can do here is I'm going to say show DBs. What that's going to do is it's going to show me the databases. Now these three databases come for free. quokka-DB, which I just deleted and then began running with, again, you can see that that is actually up and going. So what I'm going to do at this point in time is I'm going to go back and try to find the command that I did to drop the database. So this is my command, db.drop database, but first I need to say use quokka-DB. And that's going to say now I'm using the quokka-DB. Now I can do that command that was db.drop database. And this is how I mean that you need to look at the documentation. The commands and everything are more like JavaScript than they are like command line stuff. You just have to get used to that. And for me, I always have to look it up. So I'm going to say db.drop database. OK1 is giving me, this is like a kind of a JSON or dictionary type data that is giving me back that the key OK and it's successful, so I know that that was all right. If I do show DBs again, you can see that quokka-DB is not there. So we're ready to go and begin looking at the code that implements the database stuff for Mongo. Now we are going to start by looking at quokka-prime. In other words, we're not going to dive into new quokka-prime from scratch code, but we're going to look at the code that has implemented Mongo database functionality in quokka-prime because that's the best example. And just as an aside, remember that there are lessons in 52 Weeks of Python that talk about the Mongo database and show my implementation in greater detail, possibly than we're doing here. So let me show you what actually is going on or what can go on in our situation. Now you saw down here that our show DBs, right at this moment in time, we have quokka-DB because it was still running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually drop it. And now if I do show DBs and hit return, it's gone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start running the Quaka server. And the way that I do that in my existing Quaka server code, remember this isn't Quaka-Prime from scratch, but this is Quaka-Prime itself, the full implementation. I have a script that is called run Quaka, and it goes and it's beginning to run. So let's see what's going on here. All right, here it's running. Sorry about that. other stuff. This is old information. This is all the new stuff. This is where I did run quokka.sh. So there is what's going on. There's really nothing going on right now. And so what needs to happen is I need to actually run my monitors. Now this is going to run all of my monitors, including host, device, service, and port scan. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And you can see stuff is going on. We've got devices stuff. We've got services stuff. Over here you can see these dots. Now there should be a bunch of host stuff. So now there's a whole lot of things. If I go down to my database here, let's see what happens when I say show DBs. And guess what? QuokkaDB is now there. It doesn't have much stuff in it. But I'm going to say use QuokkaDB. And it's going to tell me that I've switched to DB QuokkaDB. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say show tables. So let's look at the tables that exist in QuokkaDB. So I have this devices table, and I have my host table, and I'm also doing status monitoring. So he's host status, service status, etc. So I've got all of this good stuff going and collecting data. Now, I can't remember if this is the exact command, but if I were to say db, that's referring to my QuokkaDB dot, let's say hosts dot find. This is like a command. It's going to look like JavaScript kind of to you. I'm going to issue this command, and that is actually showing me the JSON data that is stored. Can't make this wide enough for you to see it so that it looks like a table, but you can see every one of these is an entry. Every one of these is a host, and if we look at just one of these, we can see that it has an IP address, has a MAC address, it has a host name, last heard, availability. If I wrap around here, response time, it doesn't have a response time yet, but it has gone out and gotten this information for the host that it has discovered. Let me go back here and let me run this again. db.host.find. And let's see. So we still don't have response times, and I'm not sure. I believe that I actually have a bug in my response time code, and maybe that's why. But the point is we're using the database, and we're seeing that, okay, we've got this stuff here. Let's not do host, let's do devices. Actually, I should have made this easier for you to see. So let's do it like this so you can see devices.find. You can see I seem to have 3 different devices. There's a lot more information here for each of the devices. So it's gone out and gotten a bunch of information. I do have the IP address, I have the name, I have the operating system, the transport that I'm using, Napalm in all of these cases. There's a host name, there's a password, SSH port, last heard, etc. So I've got a bunch of this information that I've got, and now let's do the same thing for services, shall we? So let's go here, SER. Let's see if I spelled that right. Yeah, there's my services. There we can see I have, what, 7 or 8 services. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 different services. HTTP and DNS, NTP, ICMP, etc. So I've got all of this good information, and it's getting stored in the database. Now, the nice thing about this is as follows. If I was to go up here and do Control-C, it's going to gracefully exit. And guess what would happen in our current implementation without a database? I can tell you, and I may show you, but you can try it. If you bring down the server, you're going to lose all of your data. But guess what? When I come back here and I do the same command, I'm not going to lose any of my data. My data is still here. And the same thing with my devices. And the same thing is true with my hosts. So all of my data is still in the database. And my monitors here are running. They're failing to communicate with the server, but they're pretty resilient and they're going to keep going. And when I bring this back up, the server is going to run. And when it does run, things are going to begin to happen again. When we go and retrieve devices, you can see get, put, various stuff is going to go on as these different scanning. There's my port scans. I'm updating port scan information for the host. I'm updating device information, service information, etc. But the point is, this database is still in place and it's just getting updated as we go. So that's a very important thing about databases. The data is actually persistent. It's not transient. Okay, we're going to start our implementation of database stuff by looking at the Quaka-Prime implementation. Now, the Quaka-Prime implementation of the Quaka server functionality is called quokka-server.py. You can see by the tooltip there that this is in the Quaka-Prime directory. That's what this is. Over here on the right, I have my Python module called Quaka-Prime server. That's the one that is in Quaka-Prime-Scratch. So this is the one we've been working on. It's very short. There's hardly anything in here. You'll notice we have the global dictionaries that we're using that we mentioned was a bad idea, and that's what we want to get rid of. Now over here, you'll notice in the one that I'm going to be looking at is it's extremely long. And so I want you to not get scared, not run away, be comforted by the fact that almost all of this stuff has nothing to do with the database. So what we're going to do is look only at the database stuff. So ignore everything in here, and you're also going to need to ignore the fact that the way that we implemented our routes or our endpoints is using this class mechanism, which was required in order to implement things using Flask REST X, and that was required to do Swagger stuff. So don't worry about that. Here we just implemented it with a simple function. As you can see over here, we implemented a class, and then we have a function called get inside it and a function called put. So no big deal. Now if you look in here, ignore everything but the code to implement the get functionality. It's only one line to implement the get functionality. Guess what? Look over here. How much get functionality is there to implement? How much functionality is there to implement the get in this situation, in our current situation, our Quaka-Prime from scratch? It also is one line. The difference, here we're returning a global variable, which is the global host dictionary. Over here we're calling this function called getAllHosts. And now you may say to yourself, I wonder if that's how things generally work here. Well, look at what we do for returning stuff. If it's a put, we're not actually returning, but our functionality, our action, is to set global hosts. Over here, my functionality is just to call set hosts. Guess what it's like for devices? Over here, I'm doing exactly the same thing. Get all devices and set device. And we're going to look at that code in just a minute. But the code that is in the actual Quaka-Prime server that implements Mongo database stuff, the top level code in Quaka server is very simple and straightforward, and we'll talk about that next. Okay, I think that's enough for this lesson. We're probably going to be at about 15 minutes by the time this is done. So what did we talk about? We talked about installing Mongo. We talked about what it was like when we ran Quaka-Prime, which is accessing the Mongo database. And then we began to look at the code that is part of the Quaka-Prime implementation in order to see what we needed to do in order to make Quaka use Mongo database. And it really is quite easy, as you'll see when we go into further walkthroughs of the code. So as always, thanks for listening. If you do have questions, let me know. Thanks. Hey, thanks for watching this episode on Quaka-Prime from scratch. I'm Chuck Black. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to leave a message with this video. I'm also on Twitter at Chuck A. Black. If you want to send email with a question, comment, or just to say hi, The email address you can reach me at is python.52.weeks@gmail.com. Also, remember to subscribe to this channel. I hope these lessons are helping you to achieve your goals towards becoming a real software developer. So long for now, and see you at the next episode.